YouTube, what is good? Today we are talking about street photography camera settings. Now, street photography is just like all other forms of photography. You want nice balanced camera settings. You want a balanced exposure triangle. So your ISO, your aperture, and your shutter speed all need to work together in harmony to create a nice exposed image. But the thing with street photography is there's a lot of variables involved with street photography. You have people moving, you have light changing, you have chaos, you're moving, your subject's moving. There's a lot going on. So today I have about 10 examples on my computer that we're going to go through. I'm going to break down the camera settings on each one, what I was thinking with these settings, and how I controlled these variables to get what I was hoping for with the photo and get the best result possible. And in a few examples, get a good result kind of by accident because I actually messed up some of these settings in here today. So do me a solid before we continue on, hit that thumbs up button. It helps out the video, and subscribe to the channel. Critics have voted this channel the greatest channel on planet Earth. Actually, for real, if you want good photography videos and you want videos about photography lifestyle, kind of the life of a freelance photographer, as well as business insights and tips, this is the channel for y'all, so subscribe right now. But when it comes to all these variables in street photography, here's how I like to control them, okay? You have that exposure triangle that's made up of 3 pieces, ISO, aperture, and shutter speed, like I mentioned. I like to pick one of those for each photo that I'm trying to make and dedicate it as the most important. So let's say I'm making a photo at night and I don't want the photo to be too grainy. ISO is gonna be the most important piece of that image. So I'm gonna focus on ISO and then build the other settings around it. Let's say it's a really chaotic scene. People are moving really fast. Maybe people are running and you want to capture this motion. Shutter speed is going to be the most important piece of this formula for me. I'm going to focus on my shutter speed, make sure that's right, and then build the rest of my settings around that. Now let's say I want a lot of depth of field. I want some bokeh. I want my subject isolated. Aperture is going to be the most important piece of this formula for me. So I'm going to set my aperture and then once again build my settings around it. So our first example photo is right here. It's really easy to get your settings right in a scenario like this. All we gotta do is expose for this highlight on the wall and wait for our subject to enter a frame. So in this case, speed is what's most important for me. I wanna make sure that as the subject enters into the frame, they're nice and crisp and they're frozen in time, essentially. So I pick a shutter speed of 1/500th of a second, and then from there we build our settings around it. I drop my ISO to 250, probably could have dropped it down to 200. Who knows, in the moment I might have just picked 250 because I thought it was low enough. And then the aperture that we need to get a nice balanced exposure with our ISO at 250 is 4.5. What I was probably thinking here is that I wanted f8, I wanted a higher aperture to make sure everything was in focus and easy, but that would have required me to bring my ISO up. So I picked 250 so I could still get this 4.5. Let's say I dropped my ISO to 200, I might have had to have brought my aperture down to f4, which I didn't want. I wanted a higher aperture on this to balance with the speed, so ISO is a little less important. This next example, this is a complicated example. So this is made on my Leica Q in point and shoot mode. And essentially point and shoot mode allows you to set the ISO yourself, you set the aperture yourself, and the speed is dictated by the camera. So with this photo, I knew it was very dark and I knew I was gonna have to do a lot in post-processing to really bring out certain highlights in the image, and I didn't want too much grain in this photo. ISO 1600 made sense here. I could have pushed it to 3200 on the Leica Q, but I didn't want to get all that noise. So my priority in this image was ISO, and then from there, I wanted my speed to not be too low. Speed became a secondary priority on this. A speed of 1/50th of a second I thought was too low. I felt comfortable at 1/60th of a second. So to balance that triangle out, f2.5 worked. Now I had the option of bringing my aperture down to 1.8 maybe, and that would have brought my shutter speed up to 1/80th, 1/100th of a second, which would work better for some of y'all. For me, the rule of thumb that I use is when I'm using a low shutter speed handheld, I like to do double my focal length. So my focal length was 28 right here. 28 times 2 is 56, so 1/60th worked. In this case, I wouldn't want to go to 1/50th of a second because that's lower than double the focal length. You see what I'm saying? So with this one, I thought these settings worked out well. They kept my ISO where I wanted, kept my priority in check, and then everything balanced out nicely. Like I said, if you weren't comfortable with this shutter speed, you could go to 1.8 to bring that shutter speed up just a little bit. Now in this next example, our shutter speed is what's the priority because I'm walking towards the subject and they're walking towards me. So I want to make sure there's no movement in the image. So I choose a higher shutter speed of 1/800th of a second. Now a mistake I kind of made on this image is my ISO is at 200. I probably could have bumped my ISO to something like 400, and then I could have brought my aperture even higher to something like f8. Right now I have it set to 200. I was probably just moving a lot in the moment and wasn't thinking as clearly as I should have been, but ISO 200 allowed me to get a aperture of 6.4. This worked in this image because I had to shoot it without looking through the camera. I knew the subjects would see me and it would change their whole vibe. I wanted this photo to kind of have an Atlantic game day feel, and I wanted the emotion of the people in the photo to still be there, so I didn't want to distract them with the camera. And I knew at a higher aperture of 6.4, I'd be able to get pretty much everything in focus. There wouldn't be a lot of depth of field like if I was at 2.8. So 6.4 worked. Ideally, I would have wanted f8, so it would have been good to bring my ISO up a little bit on this image, but the priority was 1/800th of a second to make sure everything was nice and frozen. Now for our next example, the priority is our aperture. You see, on this photo, I wanted a lot of depth of field. I was looking for a subject, someone walking around with a cowboy hat. I happened to find the perfect person, and I got the perfect composition. I'm really happy with this photo. But what I was looking for here was our subject to be isolated from the background. So I set our aperture to f1.8, a super shallow depth of field. And then once again, this is another example of where I probably could have brought my ISO down a little bit so my shutter speed would come down. 1/8,000th of a second is pretty fast and pretty ridiculous, but it didn't matter. The shot is exposed properly. It looks good. So this next example is actually me just getting lucky. I included it in here because the settings make no sense, which sometimes happens when you're out making street photos. You're moving around, you're just changing your settings, trying to get a balanced exposure to capture this moment happening, and they make no logical sense, but they work because they're balanced. Right here, my ISO is at 80. No idea why it's so low when the last photo, which was in brighter conditions, was at 250. Because my ISO is so low, it brought my shutter speed down to 1/100th of a second. f1.8, it's probably at 1.8 because the previous photo was at 1.8 and I didn't change my settings over. But yeah, this is an example of me just getting lucky. Things happen to work out here. Now this photo was once again made in a setting where I set my aperture and I set my ISO. So let's say I didn't get lucky right here and my aperture was actually at f4 or f5. When I went to make this photo, my shutter speed would have balanced out probably around 1/50th of a second, creating some camera shake and probably some motion, and the photo wouldn't be what it is right here. This is me getting lucky. Wanted to include it in here just to show that sometimes luck is better than good, but these settings make absolutely no sense. Now this next image is an example of me planning properly and getting it right. So ISO 800 right here. Sometimes when I'm in a scenario where a lot is happening around me, like this, I was in traffic, I just set my ISO at something baseline. 800 is good because for the most part, it's very forgiving. You know, your shutter speed's not going to get too low regardless of what aperture you're at. It just works well. And with this photo, my priority is just a sharp image. That's all I care about because I'm driving. I'm sitting in traffic, but this scene that looked really cool is happening next to me. So I have to pay attention to the cars, and I have the camera up like this. So naturally, I just set the camera to f8 because this is going to give me basically no depth of field. We have some here because I'm so close to the window with the camera, but at f8, my focus distance is pretty good. If this was at 1.8, I doubt I would have got the shot in focus the way I wanted just because I'm moving, the car is moving, there's just so much happening. So focus was my priority right here. f8 managed to get it in focus. If you zoom in, some of the dots are a little bit out of focus because I wasn't actually looking through the viewfinder, but ISO 800, I set f8, and then our speed worked out really well. Like I mentioned, if we're at ISO 800 in a scenario like this, like daylight, our shutter speed is for the most part always going to be good. So right here, the priority was focus, hence a higher aperture. Now our next photo is actually me taking everything I talked about in the last photo and it not working the way I intend for it to work. Typically, like I said, I do ISO 800 in daylight thinking this is usually good. And then right here I have the camera set to f8 thinking this is a conservative spot to be in. Basically everything will be in focus. Autofocus will be easy. I don't have to worry too much about focus. But I got lazy with this photo and I didn't check how these two factors would change my shutter speed. And in this case, my shutter speed was 1/50th of a second. I lucked out here. Once again, I got lucky on this photo. There's not too much camera shake. Everything's clean. Everything looks good. This person was so close to me, I couldn't look through the viewfinder because I didn't want to distract them or freak them out. I didn't plan on getting their head in the photo at all. This worked really well with a set of rainy day images I was making. So I just had to make it like this from the hip. and it worked out luckily. But once again, this is an example of bad settings. To get this right, I would need to drop my aperture to something like f4, so my shutter speed will go up to 1/100th of a second, so I can get a nice clean image. This is, another good example of getting lucky and it working out, but you always got to check and be on top of what you're trying to accomplish with your photo. My goal here was a clean, sharp image, and it would have been a lot cleaner and a lot sharper if I had just paid attention to what my settings were doing and made sure my shutter speed was a little bit higher. This example, however, this is an example of everything working out the way I intend for it to. So my priority on this image was sharpness and crispness and no bokeh. You see, with reflection photos like this, sometimes your camera will focus on the ground and then the subject in the reflection will actually be blurry and bokeh'd out. So what I did to counteract this is set my camera to f8. So I had a huge depth of field. If you're at 1.8, your depth of field is really shallow. That's why you get nice bokeh. But at f8, we have a big depth of field. So everything's going to be in focus. That was my priority. And then I just set my camera settings around it. ISO 800, like I mentioned, very conservative, nice ISO, especially when you're making photos at these higher apertures like f8. And then a speed of 200 captures all the motion we need to capture. Nothing is blurry. This is nice, clean, and sharp. It's basically what I hoped would happen with the last image without all the luck that was involved. This next example is very similar to the first image where we just need to get it right. There's no real priority here. The priority is just making sure everything's balanced and good and everything's sharp. So what I do, I go with a conservative ISO of 800. We've already talked about that. It's a nice conservative baseline, especially with the cameras that I use. And then from there, I want a shutter speed that I know everything will be captured. There won't be any motion. Everything will be crisp. So I go with 1/200th of a second. And then that leaves us with f3.5, which I feel is appropriate for this. Yes, in a perfect world, it'd be nice to bump that up a little bit, but I don't want to sacrifice the shutter speed or the ISO. I don't want to change this nice balance that I have here. The takeaway on this image would be if you have an ISO that you're very comfortable with, like 800, like I am, you can take your shutter speed to the lowest point you're comfortable with, which for me is 200, and then you just set your aperture based on those two things, which in this case was 3.5. So I think we're on to our last photo right here, and this one is pretty complicated because it's the opposite of basically everything we've talked about today. We've talked a lot about ISO, we've talked a lot about aperture. This photo, the priority was the shutter speed. So that was the first thing that I set on this image, the only thing I cared about. I wanted there to be a lot of motion in this photo. This image kind of looks like it's bright outside. It was made basically at the very end of blue hour. It was almost dark. There was just a little bit of blue in the sky. And I wanted to get a lot of motion in these cars and a lot of motion in this person walking through our frame. But I also wanted them to kind of be frozen. The goal was exactly this. I got it right. With this image, I knew 10 was probably going to be the shutter speed I needed. It wasn't too low, it wasn't too high. So from there, I decided what's the best ISO to use. And I didn't want to push the ISO too much because I knew there would be some potential for editing on this photo. I might need to bring up certain highlights, bring out certain things. So I chose an ISO of 1250. Felt like a nice sweet spot. 1000 felt a little too low for how dark it was. 1600 and above felt like I was kind of pushing it. So this worked. And then from there, all I had to do is figure out what aperture worked really well. And with this image, I was a little bit concerned about the focus. I didn't think, it'd be that big of a deal, but I didn't want to have too shallow of a depth of field. I didn't want to go to like 2.8 or 1.8 or anything like that. So I went to 3.2 to make myself feel a little bit better. At the end of the day, this is a 2.8 lens. Going up to 3.2 isn't going to make a difference at all, but in my head, I was like, all right, I feel a lot better now that I'm not going to the low end of the spectrum. So 3.2 is where we landed on, and we got a nice balanced exposure and everything worked out here. But for this example, our priority was the shutter speed, and then we set everything else based on that. Our ISO was kind of our secondary primary because we didn't want to go too high, even though it was a dark image. We wanted to get something nice and clean that was editable, and we landed on 3.2 for the aperture. So that's all the examples today. That's everything. I know it was a lot. I know I just ran my mouth a ton, but that's basically my entire thought process and my entire logic when it comes to making street photos, and I think it can help you a lot. Just set that priority, figure out what's most important for an image. That is all the information I have for y'all today. Do me a solid, like I said, hit that thumbs up, subscribe, and if you have any questions, ask them in the comments. Either myself or all the beautiful subscribers on this channel who watch these videos will get back to you. They're really smart and they know a lot of good stuff in the comments section. So thank you guys so much for watching today's video. I'll see you next time.